So we are going to take about 10 to 12 minutes right now to raise some questions, raise some issues for our four speakers. So looking forward, as you ask your question, if it's specific to a speaker, let us know, and we will move forward. And I can't really see your name, so I'm just pointing, okay?
Nicholas Gerber. I just wanted to address maybe all the speakers. You introduced us to the need for a systemic approach when we are looking at reducing food loss and food waste. What I didn't hear much about in all the presentations was what's the role of the consumer in the systemic approach. Yeah? As Rob was said, there's a lot of damaged food, for instance, that is not reported as food loss because it's consumed somehow. Yeah? So where is the place of the consumers? What is the role of preferences? And what are the drivers of consumers' choices with respect to maybe food that is not always of the best quality?
And right next.
Good afternoon, Jacobine Dasgupta from Royal DSM in the Netherlands. Thank you so much for spelling out the latest research and the latest insights. And I'm also delighted to see this afternoon a couple of solutions and ways forward. What I wonder, and I address it to all the panelists, is in this complexity of different value chains, from raw materials up to end of life, how can we organize this all a little bit better to identify the hotspots, for companies to find solutions, and also for governments to set the right policies?
Thank you. And I'm going to ask, oh, yes, up front here.
Thank you. To a couple of the speakers, but perhaps to Raphael, and ties into a comment that Sunga made earlier, and I think the question about consumers, which is, I'm curious about the systemic and market-based approaches. What is the politics-based approach? Because a question of farmers advocating for their policy needs, consumers advocating for their policy needs. Dr. Ezekwesi also talked about, really, I feel like we're beating around the politics of this, and for me, politics being about power, the power dynamics of this. And then this may be, and I think we will not get far if we don't talk about politics as systemic change. And then I have a second question to our director from IFPRI. If I can walk into any chemist in Nairobi and get a little test to test for malaria, why is it that I can't walk into any supermarket or agrovet and get a little strip test for aflatoxin? Because that tool in my pocket, knowing what we know about aflatoxin and cancer in Africa especially, and coming from Kenya, where every day we're getting a new government announcement about which brand of maize meal has failed the aflatoxin test, why is it that we can't put that power in my pocket as a consumer? And I think this then also comes back to an issue of the politics of this, which I think we are not going to be able to solve this. And maybe I speak as a political scientist, which is why maybe that comes up for me. But
so the question in the second row. And if the people behind me have questions, you're just going to have to hit me on the head, because that's about all we can do. So.
Good afternoon, Richard Swanell from RAB. I was really struck by that session that the consistency around the systemic approach is so clear. But I also want to echo the first questioner that the importance of the consumer is not there. And I particularly wondered if we're underestimating it in developing countries a little bit. I was very struck with Clementine's statistic that data from Nairobi was showing per capita food waste pretty much the same level as it is in Europe, in Nairobi. And I'm wondering if we need to be thinking about this more as an urban versus rural basis rather than anything else. I just wondered, Raphael, particularly with your experience of Africa, to reflect a little bit on that and the importance of thinking about food waste in cities.
Our President has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Raphael, Matthias, Rob, and Saul, you all relate to nutrition. your organizations and your work relates to nutrition and hunger issues. So can you, at this moment of the conference, address the issue how food waste and loss reduction can serve improved nutrition? Through what mechanisms, through what systematic mechanisms? We have heard it before that ultimately this conference is about improved food and nutrition security and environmental issues. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. I'm sure you all four can say something about that.
Dirk, you had a comment?
Thanks. One of my comments related to the aflatoxin, issue, and I think one of the, the aspects to keep in mind is that the ability to detect is becoming better and better all the time, which is the reason why we're seeing more and more reports of finding aflatoxin. The residue has always been there. It's just that it's become more affordable and more widely spread in terms of the detection kits and systems that are available out there. So there's not like something has changed in that it's gotten worse. It's just that it's gotten better in terms of detecting. And then the second aspect is that there are some encouraging, trends, for example, in the East Africa Union facilitated through East African Grain Council, and adoption of common grain trading and inspection standards across the East Africa countries in particular, that are training more people on the awareness and how to detect and so forth. And then, of course, you have to go onto the prevention side, how to avoid that. So we're finding more because, again, it's becoming more common in terms of and less expensive, but we still have to keep working on the solution itself. So it's important. It's becoming more affordable on the other hand.
So last question, and then we'll have responses from the presenters across here from you.
Yes, there's a lot of talk about consumers now, and coming from the country of Denmark, we have seen the failure of consumer ethics or green consumption and so on. And I think what you mentioned about politics, and the woman in front of me, I can't see your name, but mentioned about governance. What about the role of citizens? I think that there's a danger in reducing this to a market problem and trying to make it be a proper, sort of a win-win situation. Because in many situations, win-win situations work in the short run for people who are out to make money, but we might have broader interest as citizens in our country, so I think we should include that as well.
So, very, very interesting set of questions and comments. I think I'll go in reverse order. So, Saul, respond to what part of it you'd like to respond to.
Thank you. I'll make comments on two of them. So, the first one, Nicholas, your question about the role of the consumer. We've been doing a really interesting look at a related problem, which is vegetable consumption in Kenya. We started worrying about this, not actually from the post-harvest loss perspective, but because we noticed that in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been no increase whatsoever in consumption, per capita consumption of vegetables in Kenya. And we wondered, since vegetables are an incredibly important part of a healthy diet, what do you have to do to get that to improve? And we started doing a full systems analysis, a systems dynamic analysis, to look at the whole range of factors that could potentially interact with each other. And what the preliminary conclusion from this analysis is that there's only one thing which could actually jog up the consumption of vegetables in Kenya, and it's attending to quality. Consumers in Kenya, just like anywhere else, care about the quality of the products that they're able to buy. And when they're ordered or offered really not very attractive products, they're not very encouraged to purchase them. And when you offer them more attractive products, they're more encouraged to purchase them. And this analysis needs to be refined a lot more, but I think it's clearly related here to the topic that we're discussing now. If we can put in place measures which guarantee a better shelf life, a better transport quality, better nutrient preservation of high nutrient value products, then the likelihood is that consumers will find that attractive and flock to those options, and this will be a consumer-led transformation, not necessarily just a technical and supply-led. And obviously that's directly related to Joachim's point about the nutritional issues. I think that the clearest route actually to better nutrition is through food safety. Products that have had a bad route from farm through to market tend to be not very safe, and you get sick of them, and that damages your nutritional status. There are more economically obvious, I guess, routes through price reduction, therefore greater affordability, through extending the season. But I think the recent FAO report that we've all had on the table today, and it's been snapped up, shows you that the complexity of the second and third round effects is so enormous that you're not actually sure that increasing the volume of product reaching the market is ever going to really translate into a price reduction. It might just lead, as the report suggests, to consumers trading up into a better quality of product. So I think that route to better nutritional status is much less certain, but the one through safety and preservation of the nutrient content of the product, to me, is much more convincing.
Good, thank you. Rob?
No, thanks for those very interesting and good question. I think they all underline the key point. We need this broader food system-wide approach to understand whether the solutions we have will work effectively. So I guess the questions about the role of consumer, about nutrition, about food safety, they come together. As I mentioned, the role of the consumer is should always be there, because if we tried, for instance, to reduce food loss in the sense of quality loss, we do it through quality certification. If the consumer doesn't accept or acknowledge that that's a good standard, then it won't work, and it won't provide the incentive to farmers and traders to follow through on that standard. So likewise with food safety, it may be a very good starting point in many contexts, because there's nothing more that gets disproportionate political attention than some problem with food safety, and Sol also alluded to that. So aflatoxin is a particular problem, because you don't see it, right? It may be there, but you can measure it. So more than the question is how you bring that to the fore, so that not just the consumer know it, but also everybody in the value chain. So it may not be just something you would like to measure at in the supermarkets, but maybe rather already at the farm level, where the major causes tend to show up. So I think those aspects are important, and that's why we need to look across the value chain. The same with the issue of prices, and whether the solutions are going to be passed on to prices. What it means is not only what I said, is that the adoption of the solutions need to work throughout the system, such that it's the entire supply chain that has the increased efficiency. But it also means you have to look at how the market is structured. Very often we see that those prices get passed on because there's some part of the value chain, there's a huge amount of concentration, be it at the wholesale level or at the retail level, or even also at the processor level, and that's where then the markup pricing takes place. So what it means also for the research agenda is not just looking at, try to measure across value chains how much food loss there is, but then also do related market research. What's the potential to solve it, and also what it means in terms of first, second, and third round effects, because the market will adjust to change in supply, and whether there's the demand responses also, in the sense that the consumer will accept a higher price, the premium, that may be on better quality food. Lastly, on more specifically on Joachim's point on the effect on nutrition, in our measurements of quality, we look at various ways of looking at quality. We not always are able to capture, because of the cost of it, what's the nutrient reduction in terms of less zinc and iron in beans and so on. So sometimes you have to use as a proxy what's the price that goes with it, or what's the look of the product. So that's how we've measured it most times. But ideally, if you want to get to the real nutrition effects, you have to look at, well, what's the nutrient content of the damaged crops as compared to the not damaged crops. And that's something that would make the measurements a lot more expensive, but probably it has to be done as part of improving food standards across the chain, and that might make it affordable if all products and food standards would also take that point into account, saying if you look at food losses, that we also need to look at what's the loss in quality in terms of nutrients.
Okay, thank you.
Matthias.
Matthias, yes, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the consumer is always there, is always in the back. Only if the farmer can supply what the consumer actually wants, he can make business. Otherwise, he's out of business. And of course, this is also a big role of this agriculture business center in Zimbabwe, to communicate between farmer and consumer, or a buyer. I mean, normally in Zimbabwe there are big buyers who are buying bulky products, so to say. Yeah, the consumer is not physically there. On the other hand, we are trying to supply, for example, varieties which are not yet on the market, or where you can maybe produce a certain demand from a consumer. So maybe that in the end you find, like with the pomegranates example we have heard before, maybe a product on the market which is then later on generating high prices. So I think the consumer is always there. With regard to nutrition, since we are a development organization, this is highly important, and even if we have introduced here a market-based model, we are also thinking how to foster better nutrition within the population who is very often suffering from malnutrition or undernutrition. It's a huge problem in Zimbabwe. So one example is to introduce, for example, biofortified crops. There is a cooperation going on with Harvest Plus, for example. Sometimes the problem that there is not enough seeds, for example, available in the market, but the linkage has been made there. Another issue is to diversify the crops in the fields. Yeah, people, in particular in Zimbabwe, you find this more often in Southern Africa countries. A lot of maize is produced, but beyond maize there is not so much. So to diversify the crop system and introducing millet or sorghum, sweet potatoes, and so on. And third, a very important element, to connect the rural population to health centers, to organizations which are specialized in, for example, treating undernutrition, malnutrition cases.
Okay, thank you. Raphael?
Thank you, Steve. Well, the three questions are related, right? Just around demand, demand, nutrition, and politics. So here I want to make the distinction between demand and consumption. I think for demand, I think what you see a clear pattern is that there is an increased demand for more nutritious foods. Now, in terms of consumption, I think we still face challenges, and the main challenges are around price and around the culture of each one of our societies. We had an analysis in India around consumption patterns of nutrition food, and it was interesting, fascinating to interview young wives, and there were several factors that influenced the amount of vegetables that they consumed. The first one was what the mother-in-law was telling her to do. The second one, the husband was the one buying the food, not necessarily her. The third one, you know, she didn't want to, she associated, or the women associated vegetables with poor people's food, so they didn't want to consume. And fourth, it was that the amount of time spent to cook those foods was much higher than preparing other foods. So again, the cultural part is very important in terms of consumption. The second part in terms of price, which is also important, is that these commodities, the demand is price sensitive. When you look at Ethiopia, IFRI had a study around nutritious foods, and what you see is that you find these nutritious foods in every single rural market in Ethiopia, but the prices are prohibited. If you compare, and again, the comparison is not fair, but if you compare the price per calorie of maize or grains with nutritious foods is 4 or 5 times higher. So again, what do if you don't have that much money? You buy the cheapest food. You fill the belly, but it doesn't necessarily fulfill your nutritional requirements. Now, in terms of politics here, I think, it plays a big role. Look at the priorities that African countries have and the investments being made right now. It's all around grains, it's all around input subsidies. There is very little going into other subsectors, and it's, unfortunately, it's the same thing in the developed world. Look at the $500 billion of input subsidies. It's mainly going to subsidize volume and a sector that's not performing that well. So again, how do we start to rebalance the incentive system that we have in place and the priorities that we have?
Thank you, Raphael. So now we're going to move to the three remaining panelists. And so we start with Jay Schroff, who's the CEO of UPL. Jay?